The engineers didn't believe what they were seeing. August 1st, 1941, Bethpage, Long Island. A prototype so heavy, so barrel-shaped, so impossibly wrong that grown men shook their heads watching it lumber down the runway. Chief Engineer Robert Hall sat in the pilot's seat, feeling every ounce of the beast beneath him. And when the wheels finally broke contact with Earth, it wasn't grace that lifted the XTB-1 skyward. It was pure, defiant physics. Critics within the Navy had already written it off. The biggest single-engine aircraft anyone had ever seen. Too complicated, too heavy, too ambitious for its own good. None of them knew they were staring at the future. This ungainly bird, this mechanical monstrosity dismissed as an engineering disaster waiting to unfold, would go on to sink more enemy warships than any other American aircraft in the entire war. More than the glamorous fighters, more than the celebrated dive bombers, more tonnage sent to the bottom than anything else with wings. The mathematics of naval warfare were about to be rewritten, not through elegant design or aerodynamic beauty, but through sheer, devastating effectiveness, wrapped inside an overcomplicated package that somehow, against all reason, worked better than anything else in the sky. And it started with an impossible. Request March 1939, the United States Navy issued requirements that made aircraft manufacturers laugh nervously into their coffee. The Douglas TBD Devastator, barely 2 years into service, was already obsolete. Modern war was evolving faster than anyone anticipated. The Navy needed a replacement, and they needed it yesterday. The specifications read like a fever dream. 300 miles per hour top speed, 1,000-mile range, a crew of 3, protected by armor, all ordnance carried internally, hidden from the wind, self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when punctured, and most ambitiously, an electrically powered dorsal turret, a feature that had defeated every previous attempt at implementation. 13 companies submitted proposals. Most knew they were chasing something that couldn't be built. The competition narrowed to 2 finalists. Vought Aviation offered the sleek XTBU-1, an elegant machine that won immediate praise from Navy evaluators who saw beauty in its lines. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation submitted the XTBF-1, which looked like someone had taken their successful Wildcat fighter and inflated it to grotesque, almost comical proportions. The Vought design was prettier. Everyone agreed on that. The Grumman design was complicated. Everyone agreed on that too. Vought got the initial contract, but Vought was drowning. Orders for their Corsair fighter had overwhelmed their production capacity, and they couldn't possibly deliver torpedo bombers in the time frame the Navy demanded. The contract transferred to Grumman by default, and suddenly Leroy Grumman's team found themselves staring at an impossible deadline to build an impossible aircraft. Robert Hall, the engineer deep in the trenches, looked at the mountain of requirements and understood the problem immediately. Everything the Navy wanted required adding weight, complexity, systems that had never been successfully integrated into a carrier aircraft before. The internal bomb bay alone was a nightmare that kept him awake at night. It needed to swallow either a Mark 13 torpedo weighing 2,000 pounds, or 4 500-pound bombs, or depth charges, or mines. The bay doors needed to operate reliably in salt spray, in high-G maneuvers, in combat damage. They needed to work every single time, because if they didn't, men would die carrying live ordnance they couldn't release. The powered turret presented even deeper challenges. Previous attempts at rear defensive positions had failed because hydraulic systems were slow. Manual systems were unreliable, and both were vulnerable to battle damage. Grumman chose electricity. They bet the entire design on technology that had never been proven in combat. If the electrical system failed, the rear gunner would be helpless, exposed, unable to defend the aircraft against attacking fighters closing from behind. And then there were the wings. 54 feet of wingspan when fully extended, the largest of any Navy aircraft. They needed to fold to fit on carrier elevators and hangar decks. Leroy Grumman himself solved this problem during a design meeting, using nothing but a pink eraser and paper clips. He stuck the clips into the eraser at different angles, experimenting, rotating, searching for the magic geometry. What he discovered became known as the Sto-Wing, a compound angle folding mechanism that allowed those massive wings to fold back and upward simultaneously, reducing the span to just 18 feet. Beautiful in theory. In practice, it required hydraulic systems, locking pins, structural reinforcements that added hundreds of pounds. The Wright R2600 engine, 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows producing 1,700 horsepower, was the most powerful engine available. Even this monster struggled with what they were asking it to lift. Empty weight, 10,080 pounds. Combat-loaded weight, 15,905 pounds. This made the TBF the heaviest single-engine aircraft in the world. Critics within the Navy started calling it the pregnant beast. Others called it the turkey. The names weren't compliments, they were warnings. December 30th, 1940. More than 7 months before the prototype would even fly, the Navy placed an order for 286 TBF-1 aircraft. The urgency couldn't have been clearer. War was coming. Everyone could feel it. The Navy needed torpedo bombers immediately. Complications be damned. That first flight on August 1st, 1941, revealed both promise and problems in equal measure. The aircraft flew. But it flew like a truck, heavy and ponderous, nothing like the nimble fighters pilots were accustomed to. The controls felt mushy. Visibility from the pilot's position was poor, despite the high cockpit placement. The aircraft demanded constant attention, constant correction, constant muscle. But here's what mattered. It was stable, it could carry its full load, and all those intricate systems that critics said would fail actually worked. Then, November 28th arrived. The first prototype caught fire during a test flight near Brentwood, New York. Both test pilots, Bob Hall and Gordon Israel, bailed out successfully as flames consumed the aircraft behind them. The prototype crashed and was destroyed. Critics pounced immediately. The design was too elaborate, too many systems, too many failure points. The electrical turret, the folding wings, the massive bomb bay, all of it was too ambitious. Cancel the program, cut losses, start over. Grumman's response was to accelerate. The second prototype was nearly ready. Testing continued. Modifications were made. Problems were solved through brute force engineering and midnight oil. January 3rd, 1942. Less than 5 months after the first prototype crashed. Less than 4 weeks after Pearl Harbor brought America screaming into the war. The first production, TBF-1, was completed. By early June 1942, more than 100 Avengers had been delivered to the Navy. 6 of these aircraft were assigned to Torpedo Squadron 8 for evaluation. The squadron's devastators had already deployed aboard the carrier Hornet. The 6 Avengers arrived at Pearl Harbor just hours after the carriers had departed for a crucial battle near a tiny atoll with a name that would echo through history: Midway. Volunteers were called for. 6 crews raised their hands. Many had never flown out of sight of land. All 6 aircraft made it to Midway Island through navigation and luck in equal parts. June 4th, 1942, 7:10 in the morning. 6 brand-new TBF Avengers took off from Midway Island's Henderson Field as part of the first wave of attacks against the Japanese carrier fleet. The aircraft had been in service for exactly 5 months. The crews had almost no combat experience. They were flying the most complicated torpedo bomber ever built into the teeth of the most experienced, battle-hardened carrier force in the world. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol fell upon them like wolves on sheep. Mitsubishi A6M-0s, flown by veterans of Pearl Harbor, China, the Dutch East Indies, pilots who had been killing for years, tore into the lumbering Avengers with practiced efficiency. The TBF's defensive armament, a single 50 caliber machine gun in the dorsal turret, a 30 caliber gun in the ventral position, proved pathetically inadequate against determined fighter attacks. The Avengers were slow. At maximum torpedo attack speed, they could barely manage 130 miles per hour. The Zeros could exceed 300. One by one, the Avengers fell from the sky. Ensign Albert Kyle Ernest's aircraft took hit after hit. 20-millimeter cannon shells punched through wings, fuselage, tail. His turret gunner, aviation machinist's mate third class J. Darrell Manning, was killed instantly when a cannon shell struck him square in the chest. His radio man, aviation radio man third class Harry Ferrier, just 17 years old, was wounded in the head and wrist. Blood sprayed across the cockpit interior. The hydraulic system failed. The electrical system sparked and smoked. Ernest's instrument panel shattered into fragments. He was flying blind, wounded, his aircraft disintegrating around him. But the TBF kept flying. That massive radial engine, despite multiple hits, continued producing power. The self-sealing fuel tanks, one of those intricate systems critics had questioned, prevented the aircraft from exploding when bullets punctured the wings. The armor plating, that extra weight critics said would doom performance, saved Ernest's life when cannon shells struck directly behind his seat. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. Only Ernest's battered aircraft made it back to Midway, crash landing on the runway with 1 crew member dead, 2 wounded, and the airframe barely holding together. Both Ernest and Ferrier survived their injuries. The young radioman would later recall the moment he realized they might actually make it home. Blood covering every surface, the aircraft barely responding to controls, but still flying, still fighting gravity and staying airborne through nothing but engineering and will. The surviving aircraft was examined by engineers afterward. They counted the damage in silence. At least 9 20-millimeter cannon shells, 64 7.7-millimeter machine gun bullets, nearly every major system damaged or destroyed. The Battle of Midway was hailed as a great American victory. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers. American dive bombers received the glory in the headlines and history books. The torpedo bombers, both the old Devastators and the new Avengers, suffered catastrophic losses that made admirals wince and pilots hesitate. But here's what the statistics revealed. Of the 15 Devastators that launched from Hornet, none returned. 29 men killed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean, watching the battle unfold above him like some horrific theater. The 6 Avengers from Midway lost 5 aircraft and 9 men killed. From the entire squadron, only 3 men survived the battle, 83% casualties for the Avengers at Midway. Critics renewed their calls to cancel the program immediately. The aircraft was too vulnerable, too elaborate. The losses proved it was a failure that would only kill more American boys. But intelligence officers studying that damaged aircraft, the one Ernest had somehow flown home, reached a completely different conclusion. That TBF had absorbed enough damage to destroy 10 normal aircraft. Yet it had flown home with 2 survivors. The electrical turret, despite catastrophic damage throughout the airframe, had continued functioning until the gunner was killed. The bomb bay doors had operated correctly under fire. The folding wing mechanism had not failed despite multiple hits to the wing structure. The right engine had run for 2 hours after being struck multiple times. The aircraft wasn't too elaborate. It was too tough to kill. Every intricate system, every redundancy, every backup circuit and reinforced spar had been designed into the TBF for exactly this scenario. Taking damage that should be fatal and continuing to fight. The over-engineered, sophisticated Avenger had brought its crew home when no other aircraft in existence could have survived. Production accelerated. By August 1942, dozens of Avengers were reaching fleet squadrons monthly. Torpedo Squadron 8 reformed with new pilots, new aircraft, new determination. They would go on to earn 2 Presidential Unit citations, becoming one of the most decorated squadrons in naval aviation history. Ensign Ernest rejoined the squadron and fought at Guadalcanal, earning his 2nd Navy Cross. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24, 1942, provided the first real test of Avenger tactics with experienced crews who understood what the aircraft could do. 28 TBFs from the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise attacked the Japanese fleet in coordinated waves. 13 Avengers from Saratoga's VT-8 and 15 from Enterprise's VT-3 approached from different vectors, overwhelming defenses. They sank the light carrier Ryujo with multiple torpedo hits that opened her hull to the sea. 7 Avengers were lost, but the survivors learned crucial lessons that would save lives for the rest of the war. The aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment. The electrical turret could engage multiple fighters simultaneously. The internal bomb bay allowed for quick ordnance changes between missions. The long range allowed for strikes far beyond what previous torpedo bombers could reach. November 1942 brought the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Marine Corps and Navy Avengers played the decisive role in sinking the Japanese battleship Hiyei, a 37,000-ton behemoth that had been crippled during night fighting. The Avengers put torpedoes into the drifting giant, proving the complicated aircraft could kill capital ships. But something remarkable was happening in the Atlantic Ocean, far from the Pacific headlines where glory lived. German U-boats were winning the tonnage war, sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Entire convoys disappeared beneath the waves. The introduction of small escort carriers provided air coverage for convoys, but existing aircraft were inadequate for anti-submarine warfare. They lacked range, payload capacity, endurance. The Avenger, with its cavernous bomb bay, exceptional range, and ability to carry radar, proved absolutely perfect for the role. The TBF-1D variant equipped with ASB surface search radar could detect surfaced U-boats at night or in bad weather conditions that blinded human eyes. The large bomb bay could carry depth charges, bombs, acoustic torpedoes, and the top-secret Mark 24 homing torpedo. Avengers operating from escort carriers began stalking U-boats with devastating effectiveness across the cold Atlantic. The aircraft designed to sink battleships was now hunting submarines in a completely different kind of warfare. The tactics were elegant in their brutal simplicity. Avengers equipped with radar would patrol ahead of convoys, searching the darkness for surfaced U-boats charging their batteries. When contact was made, the Avenger would attack immediately with depth charges and rockets, forcing the submarine to crash dive. Once submerged, the U-boat's speed dropped from 18 knots to 8. The Avenger would circle overhead like a patient hawk, dropping sonobuoys to track the submerged submarine while calling in destroyer escorts for the kill. If the submarine tried to surface and run, the Avenger would be waiting with more depth charges. If the submarine stayed submerged, the destroyers would arrive with their own death. From May 1943 to May 1945, Avengers flying from American escort carriers sank or assisted in sinking 35 U-boats in the Atlantic alone. British Avengers, designated Tarpon initially and later Avenger by the Royal Navy, added to the tally. The total submarine kills reached approximately 30 when counting Pacific operations against Japanese submarines. No other aircraft came remotely close to this record. The sophisticated radar systems, the large internal bay that could carry multiple weapon types, the long endurance that allowed 8-hour patrols in brutal weather, all of it combined to create the most effective submarine killer of the war. And nobody was writing headlines about it. The year 1944 brought the Avenger to its peak effectiveness and peak production. By this time, nearly 10,000 had been built. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division had taken over most production, churning out thousands of TBMs, while Grumman focused on producing the new Hellcat fighter. The transition had been remarkable. When Grumman needed to shift focus, they delivered a demonstration TBF to General Motors, held together entirely with sheet metal screws. This PK Avenger, named for Parker Cologne screw manufacturer, allowed GM engineers to disassemble the aircraft part by part and redesign it for automotive-style mass production. Leroy Grumman had doubted GM could build even one Avenger properly. Instead, General Motors produced more than 3 times as many as Grumman itself, turning automobile assembly lines into aircraft factories within months. The TBM-3, variant with a more powerful R2620 engine producing 1,900 horsepower, began reaching squadrons in mid-1944. The additional power helped offset the weight of new radar equipment. Additional armor increased fuel capacity. Every improvement made the aircraft heavier. Every improvement made it more capable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 showcased everything the Avenger could do when pushed beyond reasonable limits. The engagement, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, decimated Japanese carrier aviation in a single day. American fighters shot down over 250 Japanese aircraft. But the real test came afterward, when Admiral Mark Mitcher learned the Japanese carrier fleet was retreating at extreme range. Over 200 Avengers participated in the mission Beyond Darkness. Mitcher's desperate gamble to catch the fleeing enemy. The strike launched late in the afternoon, knowing full well that many aircraft would return in complete darkness. Avengers from the carrier Belleau Wood sank the light carrier Hio, hitting the Japanese ship with torpedoes in deteriorating weather and fading light. 247 Japanese sailors died when Hio capsized and slipped beneath the waves. Many Avengers ran out of fuel on the return flight, ditching in the ocean or crashing onto carrier decks in pitch blackness. Mitcher ordered every ship in the fleet to turn on lights, breaking all blackout protocols to guide the aircraft home through the darkness. 80 pilots and crew were lost that night, but the mission proved the Avenger could operate in conditions that would ground any other bomber in existence. The long range, the reliable engines, the tough airframe, all of it contributed to missions that should have been impossible. October 1944 brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. Over 200,000 personnel participated. The Japanese committed virtually their entire remaining fleet in a desperate, final attempt to destroy the American invasion force at Leyte. The battle sprawled across hundreds of miles of ocean, involving 4 separate engagements over 3 days. Approximately 400 Avengers participated across all phases. The engagement at Samar became one of the most dramatic confrontations in naval history, a battle that shouldn't have been winnable. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts faced 4 Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The escort carriers, designated Taffy 3, carried Avengers and Wildcats designed for ground support, not fleet engagement. When Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force appeared on the horizon at dawn on October 25th, the Americans were outnumbered and outgunned catastrophically. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commanding officer of Gambier Bay's Composite Squadron 10, directed his Avengers in continuous attacks against the massive Japanese ships closing for the kill. The Avengers had no armor-piercing bombs. Many had no torpedoes, having been loaded for ground support missions. They attacked anyway, making repeated runs with whatever ordnance they carried. Some pilots made dry runs with no weapons at all, just trying to distract Japanese gunners, buy time, make the enemy flinch. The small destroyers charged the Japanese battleships in suicidal torpedo attacks. The Avengers coordinated with them, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, creating chaos. Gambier Bay was hit repeatedly and sank, taking over 100 men with her into the depths. But the sheer ferocity of the American defense convinced Admiral Kurita he was facing fleet carriers with full air groups, not the lightweight escort carriers he'd actually encountered. After sinking Gambier Bay and 3 destroyers, Kurita withdrew through San Bernardino Strait, abandoning the attack on the invasion fleet. The Avengers of Taffy 3 had helped turn away the most powerful surface fleet Japan had sent to sea since Midway. They'd done so without the proper weapons or training for such a mission, proving the aircraft's versatility under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. One day earlier, October 24th, 1944, waves of American aircraft had attacked the super battleship Musashi as it tried to transit the Sibuyan Sea. The Musashi was the largest battleship ever built, displacing over 72,000 tons, armed with 9 18-inch guns, protected by armor up to 16 inches thick. Japanese designers had declared the ship unsinkable. They believed their own engineering. The attack began at 10:27 in the morning. 259 aircraft launched in 6 waves from 4 American carriers converged on the massive ship like birds of prey. Avengers scored torpedo hits from multiple directions. The exact number remains disputed, with estimates ranging from 10 to 19 torpedoes striking home. Each torpedo carried 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, far more powerful than standard TNT. Curtiss Helldiver dive bombers added 17 bomb hits for good measure. Just after 7:30 in the evening, the Musashi capsized and sank, taking 1,023 of her crew with her into darkness. The largest battleship ever built had been killed by aircraft. Avengers had delivered critical blows. 5 months later, April 7, 1945, the Musashi's sister ship Yamato made her final sortie. Operation Tengo was a suicide mission from the start, sending the super battleship on a one-way trip to Okinawa with only enough fuel for the outbound voyage. American submarines spotted the task force and reported its position immediately. Admiral Mitcher launched everything he had. 386 aircraft, including nearly 150 Avengers, swarmed the Japanese force like locusts. The attack began at 12:37 in the afternoon. The first wave of Avengers attacked from the port side, overwhelming Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses through sheer numbers. The second wave attacked from starboard. The third wave found the ship listing heavily, but still afloat, still fighting. The torpedo impacts continued relentlessly. American sources report at least 11 torpedo hits, though exact counts remain uncertain. Yamato's massive armor, designed to defeat battleship shells in surface engagements, could not stop torpedoes hitting below the waterline. Internal compartments flooded progressively. The list increased degree by degree. At 2:23 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 46 minutes after the first attack began, the Yamato exploded in a mushroom cloud visible for 60 miles. Casualties numbered between 2,500 and 3,100 crew members from a complement of approximately 3,000. The era of the battleship died with her. The Avengers had killed both Yamato-class super battleships. They had also sunk or helped sink 12 carriers, 4 additional battleships, 19 cruisers, 25 destroyers, approximately 30 submarines. The total tonnage exceeded 1 million tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom. No other aircraft type came close to this record. But here's what most people don't understand. The vast majority of Avenger missions were not dramatic torpedo attacks that made headlines. By late 1944, Japanese surface ships rarely ventured from port. The Mark 13 torpedo, despite late war improvements, remained problematic, requiring slow, straight attack runs that exposed aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire. Avengers increasingly shifted to conventional bombing, skip bombing, rocket attacks. The large internal bay that could carry a single 2,000-pound torpedo could also carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, rockets, or combinations of weapons. Avengers supported amphibious landings across the Pacific, dropping bombs and firing rockets against Japanese bunkers, artillery positions, troop concentrations. The missions were unglamorous but absolutely essential. The aircraft's versatility extended far beyond combat. The roomy interior could carry cargo, mail, personnel. Avengers served as air ambulances, evacuating wounded from island airstrips when time meant the difference between life and death. They flew reconnaissance missions, mapping enemy positions. They laid mines in Japanese harbors and coastal waters. They performed search and rescue, locating downed pilots in vast stretches of ocean. They provided close air support for Marine infantry fighting yard by yard, through jungle. Hell, the sophisticated design that seemed like a liability in 1941 proved to be the aircraft's greatest strength by 1945. The Avenger could do everything, and it did. One Avenger pilot who experienced the aircraft's toughness firsthand was Ensign George Herbert Walker Bush. Born June 12, 1924, Bush enlisted in the Navy on his 18th birthday, the day he graduated from Phillips Academy. He became the youngest commissioned naval aviator at the time when he earned his wings on June 9, 1943, at age 18. Bush was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51 aboard the carrier San Jacinto. He flew 58 combat missions in Avengers, logging 1,228 flight hours and making 128 carrier landings. He participated in operations against Wake Island, the Marianas, the Bonin Islands, the Philippines. September 2nd, 1944, 19-year-old Bush was flying his TBM Avenger named Barbara after his fiancée from the carrier San Jacinto on a bombing mission against Japanese installations on Chichijima. His crew consisted of Lieutenant Junior Grade William White, the ordnance officer, and radioman second class John Delaney. The target was a radio transmitter complex heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns that had been waiting for exactly this kind of attack. Bush's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire directly over the target. The engine caught fire immediately. Smoke filled the cockpit, choking, blinding. Despite the fire consuming his aircraft, Bush pressed the attack and completed his bomb run, hitting the radio facility. As flames spread through the fuselage, Bush gave the order to bail out. He headed the burning aircraft out to sea, away from the island, to give his crew the best chance of rescue, away from Japanese forces. Bush bailed out at approximately 2,000 feet. His parachute deployed successfully, but he hit his head violently on the tail stabilizer as he left the aircraft. He landed in the ocean, bleeding from a forehead wound, dazed, struggling to stay conscious. When he surfaced, he saw no sign of his two crew members. Neither White nor Delaney survived. Their parachutes failed to deploy properly. Bush inflated his life raft and paddled desperately away from Chichijima, knowing what the Japanese did to captured American airmen on that particular island. Japanese boats came out from shore, searching for him. He paddled for hours, growing weaker from his wound and exhaustion, certain he would be captured. Other American aircraft circled above, trying to protect him, drawing fire, buying time until rescue could arrive. After 4 hours in the water, the submarine USS Finback surfaced nearby. Crewmen pulled the exhausted pilot aboard. Bush was the only survivor from his aircraft. For his actions at Chichijima, completing his bomb run despite his aircraft being on fire, Bush was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He would complete his combat tour, then return stateside as a flight instructor. After the war, Bush would serve as congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president, and finally, the 41st President of the United States. Bush flew 58 combat missions in Avengers. He experienced what thousands of other Avenger pilots learned through survival. The aircraft was intricate, demanding, unforgiving of mistakes. But when battle damage came, when enemy fire struck, when systems failed, the sophisticated design kept you alive. The redundancy, the over-engineering, the multiple backups, all of it worked together to bring crews home. The statistics tell the story that critics refuse to see. Nearly 10,000 Avengers delivered, over 46,000 combat sorties flown, total combat losses, 729 aircraft. The loss rate of 1.58% per sortie was among the lowest of any combat aircraft in the entire war. Anti-aircraft fire accounted for 422 losses. Aerial combat accounted for just 47. Operational accidents, mostly landing mishaps on carrier decks, accounted for the 260. The elaborate systems that were supposed to fail rarely did. The aircraft that was too heavy to fight proved too tough to kill. Comparison with other torpedo bombers reveals the Avengers' complete dominance. The Japanese Nakajima B-5N, which had devastated Pearl Harbor, was obsolete by 1943, lacking the speed, range, and defensive armament to survive against American fighters who'd learned to hunt. The British Fairey Swordfish, despite its legendary status, was a fabric-covered biplane that survived only because it operated in environments where modern fighters were rare. The American Douglas TBD Devastator was slaughtered at Midway in a massacre that still haunts naval aviation. Torpedo Squadron 8 flying Devastators from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft and 29 crew members in their attack. The Avenger, flying the same mission the same day, brought 1 aircraft home with 2 survivors. That battered TBF proved what would become the norm: survivability through robust engineering. Post-war analysis revealed the deeper truth that should have been obvious from the beginning. The Avenger succeeded not despite its complexity, but because of it. Every intricate system served multiple purposes. The large bomb bay that added weight and complexity allowed the aircraft to carry torpedoes, bombs, depth charges, mines, radar equipment, acoustic torpedoes, reconnaissance cameras, auxiliary fuel tanks, cargo. No other aircraft had this flexibility. The electrical turret that critics said would fail proved more reliable than hydraulic systems and allowed faster tracking of attacking fighters. The Sto-Wing folding mechanism that added weight and parts allowed the large aircraft to fit on small escort carriers, multiplying the number of ships that could operate Avengers. The tough construction that made the aircraft heavy saved countless lives. Avengers absorbed damage that would destroy other aircraft and kept flying. Pilots reported flying back to carriers with wings full of holes, engines trailing smoke. Hydraulics failed, electrical systems shorted, and the aircraft still responded to controls. The overbuilt structure, the redundant systems, even the excessive weight, all of it contributed to bringing crews home alive. By the war's end, the Avenger had flown more combat missions than any other Navy torpedo bomber. It had sunk more enemy ships than any other American aircraft type. It had destroyed more submarines than any other aircraft in history. It had served in more roles, more theaters, more conditions than any contemporary bomber. The aircraft, dismissed as too intricate, had proven to be perfectly engineered for everything war demanded. The Avengers' service didn't end in 1945. Post-war variants continued, flying with the U.S. Navy until 1954, when newer aircraft finally replaced them in frontline service. The Royal Canadian Navy operated Avengers until 1960, using them for anti-submarine warfare in the frigid North Atlantic. France operated Avengers from the carrier Arromanches in Indochina during the early 1950s. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force used Avengers for anti-submarine patrol into the early 1960s. The Netherlands operated them from their carrier Karel Doorman. The elaborate aircraft that was supposedly difficult to maintain proved remarkably easy to keep flying, with many nations preferring it to newer, supposedly better designs. The aircraft's final combat use came during the Korean War. Though contrary to legend, Avengers did not fly the last torpedo attack in history. That distinction belongs to the Douglas Sky Raider, the Avengers' successor. May 1st, 1951, 8 Sky Raiders launched from the carrier Princeton to strike the Hwacheon Dam in North Korea. They carried Mark 13 torpedoes, the same weapon the Avenger had carried throughout World War II. 8 torpedoes dropped, 7 hit the dam, 6 exploded, blasting holes in the concrete structure. This mission remains the last time in history that aerial torpedoes were used against a surface target. The era of the torpedo bomber ended where it had reached its peak, with aircraft launching torpedoes against strategic targets. The Avenger had defined that era, setting standards that even its formidable successor could not exceed. Modern analysis reveals design decisions far ahead of their time. The modular internal bay that could accept different weapons without modification anticipated modern multi-role fighters. The extensive use of electrical systems over hydraulics predicted jet-age designs. The emphasis on crew survivability over pure performance foreshadowed military aviation philosophy for the next 70 years. William Schwendler, Leroy Grumman, Robert Hall, and the engineering team at Grumman Aircraft hadn't just built an elaborate torpedo bomber. They'd built the future of naval aviation, wrapped in a barrel-shaped fuselage that critics called ugly. They'd proven that survivability could be engineered into an aircraft through redundancy and robust construction. They demonstrated that versatility mattered more than specialization. The design philosophy that created the Avenger influenced American naval aviation for decades. The emphasis on bringing crews home alive became central to U.S. Navy aircraft design. The focus on multi-role capability shaped future requirements. The integration of advanced electronics and weapon systems established patterns that continue today. The numbers speak for themselves. 12 aircraft carriers sunk or helped sink, 6 battleships, including the 2 largest ever built, 19 cruisers, 25 destroyers, approximately 30 submarines, over 500 merchant ships, 1 million tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom, 729 aircraft lost out of nearly 10,000 built, 46,000 combat sorties, 1.58% loss rate. The highest kill ratio of any American aircraft in World War II, measuring ships sunk per aircraft lost. The designers who created this record never intended to build the most beautiful aircraft. They never tried to build the simplest aircraft. They built the most effective aircraft, and effectiveness required sophistication. Every system, every redundancy, every backup, every ounce of extra weight contributed to the mission. Critics who saw only complications missed the purpose behind every decision. This aircraft wasn't elaborate for the sake of complexity. It was sophisticated because war is unpredictable, and survival requires preparation for every contingency. Today, approximately 60 Avengers remain in various conditions worldwide. Several are maintained in airworthy condition by dedicated organizations and collectors. When a restored Avenger flies overhead at air shows, its unmistakable silhouette and distinctive engine note transport observers back to a time when these unlikely warriors ruled the Pacific skies. The Avenger that took off from Bethpage in August 1941, the ungainly beast that critics dismissed, proved them all wrong. It didn't do so through elegance or simplicity. It did so through relentless effectiveness, mission after mission, year after year. In every role war demanded, the sophisticated torpedo bomber that should have failed instead rewrote the rules of naval aviation and sank more enemy ships than any other aircraft in history. In the end, it wasn't elaborate enough to fail. It was sophisticated enough to win. And in winning, it brought home more of its crews alive than any other torpedo bomber ever built. That achievement, more than tonnage sunk or battle stars earned, stands as the true measure of the Avengers' success. The aircraft kept its promise. It brought them home. The human cost of Avenger operations, while dramatically lower than other torpedo bomber types, remained significant enough to hurt. Approximately 730 crews were lost in combat, representing over 2,000 American lives. Many more were wounded, carrying scars both visible and invisible for the rest of their days. The aircraft could bring crews home through tremendous damage, but it couldn't make them invulnerable. Nothing could. What the low loss rate meant was this: more crews survived to complete their tours. More pilots returned home to train new aviators, passing forward hard-won knowledge. More experience was preserved and transmitted. The engineering decisions that prioritized survivability translated directly into lives saved, families kept whole, futures that continued beyond the war. Individual acts of heroism by Avenger crews fill volumes of post-war naval history. Beyond the famous names that made headlines, thousands of pilots, bombardiers, radio men, and turret gunners flew into anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks to deliver their weapons on target. They flew missions in typhoons that should have killed them, in darkness that should have been impossible, at extreme range where fuel gauges touched empty and prayers became navigation, under conditions that violated every regulation in the book. They pressed attacks against overwhelming defenses when every instinct screamed to turn away. They stayed with crippled aircraft to bring wounded crew members home, rather than bailing out safely themselves and leaving brothers behind. The Avenger gave them a fighting chance when other aircraft would have given them a tomb. Their courage did the rest. The torpedo bomber is gone now from military arsenals worldwide. Modern anti-ship missiles accomplish in minutes what required wings full of torpedo bombers in 1944. no nation operates torpedo bombers anymore. The mission itself has been obsoleted by technology that can kill from beyond the horizon. But the lessons of the Avenger remain brutally relevant across all domains of engineering and design. In any field where lives depend on equipment performing when everything goes wrong. Over-engineering for survivability saves lives. Redundancy wins battles. Sophistication, when purposeful and well executed, creates capability that simplicity cannot match. Versatility often matters more than specialization. The ability to absorb damage and continue functioning determines who survives and who doesn't. These principles apply far beyond aviation, reaching into every discipline where humans trust their lives to machines. The Avenger demonstrated that robust construction costs less than replacement when you factor in everything. The aircraft that survived to fly again, the crews that lived to fight again, the reduced training requirements because experienced pilots stayed alive. The accountants might have preferred lighter, cheaper aircraft on the initial spreadsheet. The combat record proved them catastrophically wrong. Investment in survivability paid dividends measured in victories, won and lives saved, returns that compound across years and wars. Sometimes, the ugliest duckling becomes the deadliest hunter. Sometimes the aircraft everyone dismisses as too elaborate is exactly sophisticated enough to do what nothing else can accomplish. The Avenger proved this truth in the most demanding crucible imaginable. Combat against a determined, skilled enemy who had prepared for war while America slept. The aircraft critics dismissed accomplished what more elegant designs could not. It rewrote the rules of naval warfare. It established new standards for aircraft survivability that influenced generations of military aviation. It demonstrated capabilities that shaped how America would design combat aircraft for the next 70 years. The production achievement itself deserves recognition beyond the technical accomplishment. 9,836 Avengers built in just 3 years. At peak production, factories delivered over 200 aircraft per month. General Motors, a company that had never built a single airplane before the war, became the primary manufacturer through innovative production techniques that seemed impossible until they weren't. The transformation of automobile factories into aircraft plants, accomplished in mere months, demonstrated American industrial capacity at its absolute peak. The same assembly line workers who had built Chevrolets now built torpedo bombers, working 3 shifts around the clock to meet Navy demands that seemed insatiable. They understood what was at stake. Every aircraft that rolled off the line was another chance for American boys to come home alive. When a critic in 1941 looked at the Avenger prototype and called it the pregnant beast, they meant it as mockery. They saw only the ungainly bulk, the complicated systems, the weight that seemed excessive. They missed what Robert Hall and Leroy Grumman understood from the beginning. That elegance in engineering isn't about simplicity. It's about solving the problem completely. The problem wasn't building a beautiful aircraft. The problem was building an aircraft that could carry a devastating payload deep into enemy territory, deliver it accurately, absorb punishment that would shred lesser machines, and bring 3 American boys home to their families. The Avenger solved that problem with a completeness that still resonates through military aviation. When George Bush paddled that life raft away from Chichijima, bleeding and alone, watching his aircraft burn and sink, he carried with him the knowledge that the Avenger had done everything it was designed to do. It had taken him to the target. It had survived the hit. It had stayed airborne and long enough for him to reach water where rescue was possible. It had given him a chance. That's what the aircraft promised every crew that climbed aboard. Not invulnerability, not guaranteed survival, just a fighting chance, backed by the best engineering American industry could produce. Thousands of crews took that chance and came home to tell their grandchildren stories. Stories about the big ugly bird that flew like a truck but wouldn't die. Stories about the sophisticated systems that kept working when everything else failed. Stories about the aircraft that looked wrong, but flew right when it mattered most. long after the smoke cleared from the last battle, long after the final Avenger was retired from service. The silence still speaks of what they built and what it cost, not just in tonnage sunk or enemies killed, but in the deeper arithmetic of war. The sons who came home, the fathers who survived, the pilots who lived to become presidents and teachers and engineers themselves. The Avenger wasn't just an aircraft. It was a promise kept, engineered into every rivet and reinforced spar. A promise that when American boys flew into harm's way, they would have the best chance human ingenuity could provide to complete the mission and come home alive. And for 3 years of brutal Pacific War, that promise held firm through fire and blood and smoke. The beast they mocked became the legend they couldn't kill. The complexity they dismissed became the redundancy that saved lives. The weight they criticized became the armor that stopped bullets. And the aircraft that looked like it should never fly became the one that flew home when nothing else could.